So first off, on behalf of the Southeast Asia, East Asia, and the Pacific Regional Circle from the People's Health Movement, also the War and Conflict Thematic Circle, we'd like to thank everyone for joining us tonight, today, this afternoon, this morning, whatever the time may be on your side of the world. So just a quick, my name is Jamie Dasmariñas. I'm the current regional coordinator for the SIAP region of the People's Health Movement. So before we start, yes, just quick context of this forum we've organized today. Part of, I guess, is the concern of those in our region, especially with how pervasive the the conflict which had also erupted, especially in MENA in the Middle East and North Africa, and how pervasive it has become. And we also wanted to highlight that even though it was very far, the effect in our region, all the way here in the Asia and the Pacific, is still, or it is already very heavy. And at the same time, it's a conflict that didn't just happen overnight or didn't just happen within the last few months or the last few years, especially with the number one imperialist power in the world involved, which is the United States of America. So us in the Asia Pacific, we aren't strangers to the presence of the US powers, be it with if whether we're talking about sovereignty, whether we're talking about military power, whether we're talking about economic power and influence. The US has always dipped their fingers in our region, so to speak. I myself, personally, I come from the Philippines, and we have been at the forefront of the tug of war between the number one imperialist power here and an emerging new power. But we're here to focus on the existent US bases. So that's one way they have helped influence or spread their influence rather in our region, even though it's on the other side of the world from the United States. And we've invited four speakers to discuss that it goes beyond just the arms race. When we say global influence, it's very pervasive until the grassroots. And it affects even the health of even the most ordinary citizens. Even though you think you are not involved, it can influence your life as well. So I won't keep this long. I will be passing the baton on to two of our moderators. So I'll be introducing them. So we have Sir Chan Chikun, Dr. Chan Chikun from the Citizens Health Initiative in Malaysia, and Ms. Maricar Piedad from the Ibon Foundation from the Philippines. So guys, take it away.
Thank you. Thank you, Jamie. Can I first clarify from Deepika? We are scheduled for 1.5 hours. If we run over time, is there a possibility that we could extend for another 15 or 30 minutes beyond the 90-minute time mark?
Yes, I think it should be possible, Chikun.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, so I can afford to be a bit less disciplined. Okay, but in any case, okay, I think I'm not here to we're not here to listen to the moderators. Okay, so I'll quickly move on to the speakers. The way we've set it up, I'll be co-moderating the forum with Marika Piedad from Ibon. My name is Chan Ji Kun from Citizens Health Initiative in Malaysia, and I was told by Paul Laris, okay, that Richard Tanter, okay, might have to leave a little bit early, may not stay until the end of the forum. Okay. So we've decided on a format in which the first two speakers, Richard Tanter and IRB, okay, will speak for 15 minutes each, to be followed by a 10-minute discussion period, of both presentations, and then Marika will take over for the remaining two speakers. Likewise, 10 minutes for a discussion, okay, for those presentations. For the online participants, please feel free to post questions for the speakers in the chat box. When I'm moderating, Marika will be monitoring the chat box, and she will call upon those who have questions, okay, to present the questions, okay. And likewise, I'll be monitoring the chat box when Marika is moderating. So without taking up more time, let me introduce our first two speakers. Richard Tanter was a professor at the RMIT, Royal Melbourne Institute of Technology, and the University of Melbourne, working on militarization and intelligence issues in Australia and East and Southeast Asia. He's currently Senior Research Associate at the Nautilus Institute. In March 2024, he published a complaint to the Australian Signals Directorate that the Australian US satellite communications and signals intelligence surveillance base near Alice Springs at Pine Gap risked Australia's complicity in genocide in Gaza. With Vince Scapatura, he has been working on a Nautilus project on nuclear-capable B-52 bombers in Australia. That's Richard Tanter, okay? Abe is a visiting researcher and part-time lecturer at the University of the Ryukyus. After graduating from the Faculty of Law at Kyoto University in 2002, she worked as a director at NHK producing television programs. She completed an LLM in International Human Rights Law at the University of Essex and currently serves as a secretariat for the All Okinawa Council for Human Rights. She's the author of Okinawa and International Human Rights Law. Okay, Richard, please take the floor.
Thank you very much, Shekun. It's very kind of you. And my thanks to the organizers for accommodating me. I'm sorry I have to leave in about an hour, so forgive me. I'll just put my screen up on share for the moment. Okay. Okay. Well, first of all, I'm speaking to you from Naarm, from Melbourne in Australia. And I'd like to acknowledge the land on which I live, the land of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and acknowledge my respects to their elders, past and present, and those who are emerging. This is sovereign Indigenous land in Australia, although it's still obviously a struggle for that to become recognised. It should be a simple matter of elementary politeness that I acknowledge that. But of course, the very far swings in other countries to the far right are relevant here. And now there is great resistance from conservative forces to even acknowledging the fact of this state, this society, this culture I live in, built on 200 years of violence. And that's relevant, I think, beyond a wider frame, to understanding the very peculiar Australian habit of clinging to empire, first the British and then the American, and refusing to recognise that we not only live in Indigenous land, but we live in an Asian region which for most of the last 3,000 years has been within a Chinese sphere of influence. Our governments find that very, very hard to cope with. We live, I think, in Australia in a kind of, well, that foreign policy outlook is a kind of denial, a collective denial, which impedes us seeing the true nature of American bases and our dependence on the United States. Let me say something very quickly about the health consequences of the US bases that I'm going to be talking about and those that others on this terrific panel are going to be speaking to. Well, where do we start? Well, as the poet said, let me count the ways. Firstly, most obviously, the direct violence and the trauma. Trauma which of course is a medical term originally and is involved in an immediate sense, which we see in many parts of the world, but most particularly at the moment in Gaza and Iran. We see it in the short-term effects. We see it in the long-term effects. Any of us who have grown up in a place like Australia, where in my childhood was dominated by the memories of the Second World War, know how ramifying that was, to say nothing about our involvements in other countries subsequently. Secondly, apart from that direct violence, the destruction of the infrastructure of our life forms. Firstly, the built environment. As President Trump said, I'm going to destroy a civilization. Why not? I might not. This kind of appalling, deeply, deeply violent, intimidatory threat, and which is being carried out in many respects. That really, that threat to the infrastructure of life, towns, cities, whole countries in Trump's imaginary. Thirdly, the destruction of the natural environment, which many people on this event probably have seen in their lifetimes in different ways, by war. The simple way of thinking about it, the Pentagon being the largest producer of fossil fuel pollution in the world, is one simple but inadequate way of thinking about that. When I write about B-52s in Australia, I remember, of course, that before they were here, they were destroying large swathes of Vietnam with still resonant effects there. More abstractly, but I think very potently, the theft of possibility for decent and viable life in the form of what the economists call the opportunity costs. In other words, the money stolen to pay for war, which is now coming to fantastic levels of massive expenditure. And lastly, the health consequences of really attempting to foreclose the possibilities of authentic democracy and national sovereignty in each of our countries by forcing our societies, our states, our economies into the imperial mould. In the case of Australia, it's not a matter of American penetration, it's a matter of the saturation of our polity and our military systems by the Americans. So where do we start? Well, actually, this image I have today, I was thinking of friends in the Philippines, because it could easily have been taken in recent military exercises involving the United States, the Philippine Army, and the Australian and the Japanese Self-Defence Forces in the launching of missiles, in this case, in Australia, in what the Americans called the first multinational HIMARS launch on Australian soil, highlighting regional unity and modernisation. There's a lot of that about. Okay, where am I going? Well, the chair kindly mentioned some work that I did with colleagues about the war in Gaza and what is quaintly called under Australian legislation a complaint to our major signals intelligence agency, the Australian Signals Directorate, making what sounded, when the moderator read them out, a rather moderate complaint. Oh, there may be a risk of complicity. Of course, I knew then, and we know even more now, that Australia is deeply complicit in the war in Gaza, in particular by providing facilities to the United States for intelligence surveillance, which is then passed on, firstly from Australia to the United States, and then from the United States National Security Agency to the Israeli Defence Force. And there's information here if you click on either of those images in the PDF. And I think the organisers have the link for that. You'll be able to talk about that. Just very briefly, these are the major bases that I'm going to be saying something about. In the middle, Pine Gap, that I've just mentioned. I'm going to be mentioning over here, Northwest Cape, or a huge American communication facility. I'm going to be mentioning down here, outside Perth, a growing submarine facility. And although not marked, but here where there is that aeroplane facility there, a place called Katherine, an Australian base called Tyndall, which is being turned into a major US nuclear-capable power projection facility. But to resume the story, let me go on. Firstly, we are deeply involved in American nuclear planning. We have been for a very long time. There's an old story, the story of Northwest Cape, the submarine communication facility going back to the 1960s, which enabled the American Americans to target the Soviet Union accurately, and Pine Gap, that big facility I'll say a little bit more about in the middle of Australia, which is actually three separate facilities in one, but they are extremely important American American surveillance facilities. Let me say something quickly about each of those. Firstly, Northwest Cape, which you can really not, I'm sorry, not see in this photograph. It's interesting how few photos there are of it. Those masts that you can see there are about 300 or 400 metres tall. There are 12 of them, and they hold up an enormous set of very large steel cables, which form an antenna with about 1,000,000 watts of power going out of them to reach all over the Pacific, all over the Indian Ocean, throughout Southeast Asia and East Asia. But in particular, they have the characteristic of being one of the few forms of communication which can actually penetrate seawater to at least about 50 or 60 metres. And that makes it, for American nuclear command and control, an immensely important facility for communicating with its nuclear submarines, going back to the 60s and still today. It's long been assumed by Australian governments, they have known, and though they did not say to the American Australian people, that it was a nuclear target in the days of the Cold War, and it would still be today. Formally, it's an Australian Navy facility, but the Americans are back in force, I promise you. Secondly, I mentioned Pine Gap. There's a lovely photo of it by an activist some of you may know, Felicity Ruby. This is a facility just outside the town of Alice Springs, right in the centre of Australia. And it's perhaps the largest and most important American intelligence facility outside the United States itself. It's one base. It's called the Joint Defence Facility Pine Gap officially. But in fact, it is three separate systems, three separate surveillance activities, and of course, one nuclear target. The original part of it is for, it's a control station, a ground station for half a dozen or so American huge intelligence collecting satellites in space in a string over the Indian Ocean from the middle of the Pacific to the Western Indian Ocean, which can listen to a huge array of electronic transmissions. Of course, it's relevant to Gaza as well as to nuclear war. Secondly, there's the reverse of that, antennas at Pine Gap, which are listening, pointed upwards, listening to the foreign communications of all of the countries, I imagine, here, as well as Indonesia, as well as China, as well as Russia. And of course, all of that goes to the National Security Agency. And then it has a third facility, which is extremely important for nuclear war, which is it's a relay ground station for another set of about 4 or 5 American infrared early warning satellites, which give the American president the proverbial 20 minutes of warning that Armageddon is here. But also it permits the Americans to work out, for example, which Chinese missiles may have been fired and which not, and which then, that second group, become nuclear targeting. So we are in deep, and we've been in deep for that for a very long time. The news story is about submarines and bombers. The news story is about our direct involvement in American nuclear and conventional power projection, but particularly nuclear capable projection. I should go actually to the second part of this first. This is the RAF-based Tyndall. It's in the Northern Territory outside the town of Catherine, and it is immensely important for the Americans. We have spent about $1.5 billion upgrading it from what it was. The Americans have spent $500 million of their dollars specifically for an American squadron operations facility for fuel reserves and a huge long hardened apron for the biggest aircraft in the world, B-52s and their C-17 transport. What this is going to do when those B-52s arrive in a week or so, when they arrive later this year or early next year, for the first time we will have nuclear capable American bombers operating from Australia. And if you were a Chinese air defense general, if you saw these coming at you over Indonesia, over the South China Sea, you wouldn't really spend a lot of time worrying about whether these were actually the nuclear capable ones or the ones, small number, which are not nuclear capable. For the first time, we have moved from supporting command and control to direct involvement in nuclear combat missions. But also things like in Darwin, in Northern Australia, we have now allowed the Americans to build a huge fuel centre solely for the American aircraft, full of aviation fuel, 80 million gallons, 303 million litres. This last part is part of Australia's story, which is shared with Japan and the Philippines and the Republic of Korea in terms of the US restructuring alliance relationships around interoperability. Abe-san will be, I think, very familiar with that, around combined force structures. So our Space Command, a pitiful little thing, but is of course really a subsidiary of the American Space Command, operates at combined facilities, combined US, Australian. And apart from weapon systems, these fuel facilities, which now, for example, in the Philippines, the United States is preparing under its so-called agile combat employment procedures for not just weapons platforms, but logistics and fuel.
3 minutes,
What's the way out?
Richard.
Yep. What's the way out? Firstly, let us talk about our interest versus American interest, national interests, the human interest. Spain's quite wonderful no refusal to allowing United States bombers to use Spanish bases for illegal war. Secondly, resistance to particular US bases. And Professor Abe, I'm sure, will have a lot to say about the extraordinary history of Japanese resistance there. Thirdly, an example what this talk is doing, and I'm very grateful to be part of it, rebuilding. And I think for me in Australia, it is a matter of rebuilding something that was lost, networks of resistance and mutual support across the Pacific, East Asia and Southeast Asia. And then just last night, the International Campaign for the Abolition of Nuclear Weapons, the Australian board, which I'm a former president, issued a new call for no nuclear weapons under any circumstances in Australia in any form. And lastly, I think the way out involves something which is going to take a lot longer to talk about, but is really important, which is simply rethinking that word defence, of what it actually means and what it can mean, what it can be made to mean. Defence in whose interest? Firstly, our interests and not American interests. But beyond that, there's a great many other interests. We also need to ask, what are the alternatives? What are other ways of defending our countries, our societies against what may be, when I say may, be genuine threats, and of course, what are specious propaganda threats? And lastly, what we're doing tonight, building connections, building a new path to peace. Thanks very much, Sike.
Thanks very much, Richard. I'm very much tempted to interject a brief comment about resistance. Maybe I'll leave that till the discussion period. Ms. Abe, please go ahead.
Thank you very much for your kind introduction. Thank you very much. Could you share this? Yes, thank you very much. Hello, this is Abe. I am a visiting researcher at the University of AUKUS in Okinawa, Japan. Today, I'm going to talk about the militarization and the public health, the ongoing cost of the US military presence in Okinawa. I speak today not as a public health expert, and I want to be upfront about that. My lens is international human rights law, and my work has been in civil society advocacy, bringing Okinawa's voice and situations to the UN human rights mechanism. But I think that law and public health are inseparable here, because what happens to people's body and lives in Okinawa cannot be understood without understanding the legal and the political structure that produced it. That is the perspective I want to bring today. So I would like to contribute today's webinar by looking closely at one specific place, Okinawa. Stay with this slide. Okinawa. Professor Tanto explained the role and the current situation of major US military facilities across wider arc in Australia and this region. And I would like to take that arc and bring it down to the ground level, to one island chain, and and how the presence of the US bases have actually impacted the people living here. Yes, let me briefly explain Okinawa. Okinawa is Japan's southernmost prefecture, consisting of a chain of small islands stretching over 1,000 kilometers. It is located at the center of the circle connecting Japan, mainland Japan, Korea, China, and Taiwan. It is a region that has lived under not one, but two waves of imperial domination. First, Japanese imperialism, then American imperialism, military occupation from 1945, and a militarization that has never truly ended. Yes, next slide, please. Today, Okinawa hosts approximately 70% of all U.S. exclusive use military facilities in Japan, despite comprising only 0.6% of the country's land area. This is not a historical footnote. It is an ongoing reality, and it has an ongoing cost. The cost is what I want to talk about today, specifically the cost to public health and why that cost must be understood as a human rights issue. Next slide, please. To understand why Okinawa faces the public health challenges I will describe, we need to start with the structure, and the structure begins with history. Okinawa's marginalization is the product of two distinct waves of imperial domination. The first is the Japanese imperialism. Before 1879, Okinawa existed as the Ryukyu Kingdom, an independent country with its own language, culture, and a political institution. In 1879, the Japanese Meiji government forcibly annexed the kingdom, deposed its king, and began a systemic process of assimilation. The Ryukyuan language was suppressed, imperial subject education replaced local culture. And at the end of the World War II, Okinawa was designated as a battlefield between Japan and the US, resulting in the loss of approximately 1/4 of its entire population. The second is the American imperialism. After the war, Okinawa was placed under US military administration until 1972. It was reversed to Japan. But even after its reversion to Japan, the militarization did not end. It was in many ways simply transferred from direct occupation to a permanent basing structure that continues to this day. This history matters because it produced a structure in which Okinawa's political voice has been systemically suppressed, making it easier for Japan and the US government to concentrate military burdens there. A structure in which the communities living alongside these bases have limited power to resist, limited access to information, and limited avenue for legal remedies. It is the structure that continues to generate ongoing human rights violation in Okinawa. Today, I would like to focus on two cases that are particularly relevant to the public health, PFAS contamination, and the spread of the COVID-19 through US military bases. Next slide, please. I will begin with the case of the PFAS contamination of water and soil around US military bases in Okinawa. PFAS are a group of synthetic chemicals that have been associated with serious health risk, including increased rate of cancer and adverse effects on the child development. In January 2016, Okinawa Prefectural Government announced that the high concentration of PFOS and P4, that's a part of PFAS, had been detected in rivers and water sources near US military bases, and that Kadena Air Base US military base was presumed to be the source. Approximately 450,000 people had been exposed through contaminated drinking water. Subsequent investigation confirmed contamination around multiple US bases across Okinawa. Blood tests conducted among residents living near the bases revealed PFAS levels significantly higher than the national average. Next slide, please. So what happened next? Did the government investigate or did the military cooperate? The answer is no. Okinawa Prefecture requested access to U.S. military facility for on-site investigation on 4 occasions. All 4 requests were denied. Under the Status of Forces of Agreement between Japan and the U.S., it's called SOFA, such investigation requires the consent of the U.S. military, and that consent was never given. The Japanese government, including the Ministry of Defense, maintained that the clear causal relationship between the contamination and the U.S. military activities had not been established. And yet, according to the reports, the U.S. military acknowledged internally in 2023 that its training activities were likely the source, while simultaneously informing the Japanese government that it would reject Okinawa Prefecture's request for investigation. The Japanese government did not disclose this to the public. In February 2026, a civil society group filed a pollution mediation petition with the Okinawa Prefectural Pollution Dispute Review Board. It was dismissed on the grounds that the defense facilities fall outside the scope of the Pollution Dispute Resolution Act. The board itself acknowledged that this as a deficiency in the law, but it ruled that it had no jurisdiction. To summarize, contamination confirmed, source presumed, access denied, information withheld, and legal remedy unavailable. Communities like Okinawa, marginalized through layers of imperialism and militarization, face enormous structural barriers to obtaining remedy through domestic political or judicial processes. Discrimination, in a sense, has been built into the system itself. Next slide, please. This is precisely why I work in the international human rights law and why I'm involved in the advocacy through international human rights mechanism. For communities that cannot find a remedy at home, these mechanisms offer a different avenue. Imperfect and slow, but sometimes the only one available. The PFAS case illustrates both the potential and the limit of that avenue. From a human rights perspective, this case involves multiple overlapping violations: the rights to safe, clean, healthy, and sustainable environment, the rights to water, the rights to health, and critically, the rights to information. The civil society organization in Okinawa brought this case before several UN bodies. In 2024, even the Okinawa prefectural government invited the UN Special Rapporteur on Toxic and Human Rights to visit. The Special Rapporteur subsequently addressed PFAS contamination in his report on military activities and toxics. And I remember, I believe he mentioned about Australian case as well, and sent communications to the Japanese government for several times. In the same period, please stay with this slide. In the same period, Japan revised its Water Supply Act to include PFAS in legally binding national water quality standards for the first time. It is difficult to draw a direct causal line between these developments, but it is significant. It is significant that the marginalized communities was able to access international human rights mechanisms and demand state responsibility in international framework, and something moved. Yes, so please go to the next slide. My second case takes us to the COVID-19 pandemic and what happened in Okinawa when a U.S. military base became in effect an information black box. In late November 2021, the Omicron variant was first reported in South Africa, rapidly drawing global attention for its high transmissibility. On December 17, 2021, Okinawa Prefecture announced its first confirmed Omicron case. The infected individual worked at a Camp Hansen, a U.S. Marine Corps base in northern Okinawa. And at that moment, it was revealed that a cluster of approximately 100 Marines had already been infected inside the base. Okinawa Prefecture immediately launched emergency PCR testing over the following 2 days. But it was too late. Confirmed cases among base employees continued to rise daily, and new infection numbers broke records day after day. At that time, Japanese government has implemented strict border control measures, in principle prohibiting the entry of all foreign nationals from every country and region. But there was one group exempt from these measures, and that is the U.S. military personnel. Under the Status of Forces Agreement, U.S. troops arriving directly at military bases are not subject to Japanese immigration screening or Japanese quarantine procedures. In principle, the U.S. military is responsible for conducting its own quarantine and is required to notify the relevant Japanese authority when such cases detected. However, the foreign minister later noted that the U.S. took policy of U.S. military personnel entering Japan were exempt from pre-departure testing based on vaccination efforts, and that the foreign ministry had not been informed on these U.S. measures. Next slide, please. So what this means is that the two central pillars of Japan's border control policy, entry prohibition and quarantine, did not apply to the U.S. military personnel entering through military bases. And access to information critical to public health was subject to discretionary judgment of the U.S. military. When pressed on this, Japan's chief cabinet secretary stated at the press conference that maintaining the readiness of U.S. forces in Japan while preventing the spread of COVID-19 is an extremely important challenge. And the foreign minister similarly declined to demand accountability from the U.S. side, citing its relationship with the U.S. So the public health necessity, in other words, was remarkably easily overridden by military logic. From an international human rights perspective, this constitutes a violation of rights to health as recognized under the International Covenant on Economic, Social, Cultural Rights, in particular, the right to access health-related information. The Japanese government was obliged to secure the rights by pressing the U.S. military for transparency and cooperation. Instead, it defers entirely to military logic, and the rights of Okinawan residents were abandoned with striking ease. What these cases suggest is the structural condition, one in which the military priorities systemically override the public health rights of a community. These two cases I have presented today offer some observations. First, military installations function as information black boxes, even in peacetime. When they affect the environment, human health, and the rights of local communities, information is withheld, accountability is deflected, and the remedy becomes extraordinarily difficult to pursue. Second, when these installations are located in historically marginalized communities such as Okinawa, their impact does not remain an isolated incident. It becomes structurally embedded, and its consequences grow more severe over time. Okinawa is not a unique case, I believe. I believe the same structural condition can be found across Asia Pacific, wherever military bases exist in communities whose political voices have been historically suppressed. My hope is that forums like this allow those communities to find each other, to identify what they share, and in doing so, make visible what has remained hidden for a long time. That's the end of my presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ayabi. Yeah, you ended right on the dot, the 15-minute dot. Reminded me of the time I spent sabbatical in Japan. Okay, the arrival and departure of a Shinkansen. Okay, bullet trains. Anyway, we are doing pretty good. We're only 5 minutes behind time. Okay, based on a 90-minute schedule. Okay, so if I can exercise my prerogative as a moderator to ask one quick question each to Richard and I. Richard, a while back, quite recently, again, there was a bit of a fluff, okay, over the U.S. attempts to acquire overflight rights, okay, over Indonesian airspace, and presumably, okay, the concern was the excess of Australia-based US aircraft crossing that large archipelagic airspace to East Asia. So I was wondering whether how significant is that facility, given that there are already air bases, US air bases in Okinawa, other parts of some of the other islands, the first island chain, um, and even Singapore, which out of which the P-8A, Poseidon aircraft operating out of the Singapore air bases. So how significant is that, especially considering also that you have ballistic missile submarines which can launch long-range missiles pretty much from much of the Pacific. So how significant is that? Question for you mentioned that in Okinawa, the activists managed to get the Japanese government to enact for the first time binding limits on PFAS, right? PFAS. Were those limits applicable also to US air bases? US bases, military bases, yeah. Right. Two questions. Yeah.
Okay, I'll talk very quickly about the issue of overflights that CK has raised. It specifically involved flights out of the United States going west across the Pacific over parts of Australia and Southeast Asia towards Yemen. There were specifically flights by B-2 bombers out of, they are all the American B-2 bombers. They're the kind of Batwing kind of ones. They're based at Whiteman Air Force Base, somewhere in the south. I can't remember in the United States, maybe Louisiana. I'm not sure. They're only at one base. They could either have flown east across the Atlantic and then over Europe from the Mediterranean and then down over Saudi Arabia and so forth, where, as you point out, there probably would have been no problem about getting the overflights. I think that what happened in the case of the B-2s flying to bomb Yemen now about 18 months, 2 years ago, was that they flew from Whiteman to Guam, which of course colonized territory, they can go there. And then they had a choice of, well, how do we get across to the Indian Ocean and then to Yemen? And there were two parts, basically. One was going over Indonesia and Malaysia, which, as far as the Americans concerned, and had the problem of being majority Muslim countries, when, of course, it was very evident that the Americans were going to bomb a major Muslim country, in this case, Yemen, but aimed at Iran. And of course, the Australians were only too willing to be compliant. We allowed American refueling aircraft to operate from North Queensland and the Northern Territory to ensure they could keep going all the way through to Diego Garcia in the middle of the Indian Ocean and then on to Yemen. What has been interesting is that since then, with all the bombing of Iran, the Americans have not used that route over the Pacific. So you asked how significant was Indonesian and Malaysian. I think I would call it unease rather than outright refusal. The Americans took note of it. And then, of course, the Spanish and then the Italians said, well, you can't use our bases either. So all of these forms of resistance, they count.
Okay, I thought it was more pertinent to the overflight of B-52s based in Australia, reaching East Asia. Is that
I wish
not relevant?
I wish that were true, but I think that has not been a highly articulate position. When AUKUS was first announced, there were some discussions about that obvious fact, but they've gone very quiet now, and particularly in Indonesia with President Prabowo Subianto. I'm not sure we're going to hear a lot for a little while about that, but it's obviously a major issue.
Okay, thank you. Hi.
Hi, yes, unfortunately, and I think you could easily imagine, but Japan's Water Supply Act does not apply to the US military bases. However, the existence of such legal standards is valuable, I think, in the sense that it provides like legitimate grounds for Okinawan people to demand action from the government. And since this law applies throughout Japan, not only in Okinawa, but throughout Japan, it is important not only for people in Okinawa, but also for the residents in mainland Japan who were similarly affected by the PFAS contamination, who live close to, for example, a huge base in Kanto area, Tokyo area. And also another issue is that while it is welcome that the legal standards have been established, the problem is that these standards are very lax compared to the US standards. So civil society is calling for the standards to be changed to stricter ones.
Thank you. Marika, how are the questions in the chat box?
No, there's no question in the chat box. Yes. I'm
Well,
checking.
let's open it to everybody, anybody, yeah. On the panel, off the panel, yeah.
Can I ask question? Am I allowed?
Sure.
Yeah, it's for Mr. Richard Tunter. Like,
Yeah.
for example, here in the Philippines, so we have a Balikatan exercise wherein
Yeah,
the
yeah,
US, the
yeah,
Australian, Japan armed forces
yeah,
participate. So, this month only, like 2 weeks ago, the US Armed Forces launched a Tomahawk missile from one of our islands in the Visayas. It's the Tacloban
yeah,
Airport, using a
yeah,
civilian facility to another part of our country. It's
yeah,
another island, like more than I think 1,000 kilometers away.
yeah,
So,
yeah.
do you see, or do the Nautilus Institute monitor a growing trend of the U.S. Armed Forces using civilian facility to launch such exercises?
Well, they're certainly using both countries for missile launches, and that image I had at the beginning was, I forgot to put in the parallel one I had from the Balikatan exercise, which was astonishing to see exactly the same lineup there. And they are working, they're not necessarily in Australia using civilian facilities, but they are using training grounds, huge training grounds. I mean, really big. One of them is as big as Cyprus, for example, which the Americans don't have available to them, certainly in Northeast Asia or other parts of Southeast Asia. And they're using those. And they are, I think the most important thing that's happening in both cases is, I hate this metaphor, they're boiling the frog. They are accustoming the populations of Australia and the Philippines that their armed forces need to operate the same facilities, the same missiles. You mentioned Tomahawks. We are also getting Tomahawks there, but now Tomahawks are now rather old weapons. The Americans are pressing us not only to acquire, but to, I was going to say manufacture. We don't actually do much manufacturing here. We're going to bolt them together, assemble American missiles here. So both countries are under pressure and to collaborate on this. And this is this interoperability, which I will be a term I will be very familiar with from Japan, and it's now pressing in to integrate all of our militaries much, much more, and that will have impact on civilian land in due course.
Okay. Okay, we're now at the 6:49 time mark. Okay. So
Second, there's a question from a
okay.
comment. Yeah,
Yeah,
from
go ahead.
Polaris.
Right.
I think it's for Miss I, Abe. Any comments about the similarities and repressive effects of the Forces Posture Agreement in Australia and the SOFA Agreement in Ryukyu? So I think it's for the two speakers, actually. Hello? Yeah,
Yes.
okay.
Unfortunately, I'm not familiar with the Australian status of forces of agreement between with the U.S. government. So I'm not in the position to be able to present the similarities or differences. And one note is that status of forces of agreement in Ryukyu it says, but it is between the Japanese government and Japanese government and the US. So it's not like Ryukyu is not a part of this agreement. Ryukyu is affected by the agreement, but it's not a part of the agreement. So I just wanted to clarify on that. And I'm sorry, but I'm not in a position to like make a comparison or similarity. If Professor Tanter knows more about it, I would really like to know from you.
Well, I'm not sure how much I can say. Certainly, I'm familiar with a little bit with the Japanese Status of Forces Agreement, which I think was established at an earlier stage, an even more oppressive part of the Cold War than the one that we signed up for from memory in the late 60s or early 70s. What is similar is the American refusal to release information. But I would say the thing I want to say is that the Australian government is very complicit in that. The Australian government not only goes along with what the Americans won't do, but for example, in the research that I and my colleagues do, we find out more about what the Americans are doing in Australia from the United States government and United States sources than we do from the Australian government. And I think that's probably not very unusual in Japan either. And so that's a common thing. So pressing for freedom of information, genuine freedom of information, not freedom from information, is extremely important for both countries, for all of our countries. And I have to say, in our case, we've gone rather backwards. We have a nominally progressive Labor government, but in fact, it has becoming very clear that it is offering no more resistance to the Americans than their conservative predecessors, and is being no more open about the issues of information access. So I think they're very similar, and it would be worthwhile spending some time perhaps talking together on another occasion about this. And about, can I just say, your human rights emphasis. There's another webinar on tonight here involving another group, the Independent Peaceful Australia Network, on the impact of heightened legal security, repressive security regulations emanating from both AUKUS and from the B-52's deployment. It's now getting very serious. And that's, again, I think, a similarity with Japan and in other places. Thanks very much for your talk. I learned a lot. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Okay.
Okay. Chikun, your mic is off.
I was just thanking both our speakers, okay? And we are now at 6:53. So Marika, you want to take it over for the remaining two speakers?
Okay. So now I will introduce our next speaker. So she is Professor Judy Tagiwalo from Philippine Center for Anti-Imperialist Studies, and she will talk about the economics of war and the socio-political repercussions of imperialist war games in the global south of the South Asia and Pacific, and what this means for the health of the people. Professor Judy Tagiwalo is the current coordinator of PICAIS, a private nonprofit institute dedicated to research and analysis on issues related to U.S. imperialism and its impact to the Philippines. She is a retired professor from the University of the Philippines College of Social Work and Community Development. So she is also a former secretary of the Department of Social Welfare and Development in the Philippines. So with no further ado, I'm introducing Professor Judy Tagiwala. Take it away, ma'am.
Hi everyone, good evening. I'm going to share screen now. Okay, I hope you can see my slide. Is it okay?
Yes,
Yes,
ma'am,
it's
we can
fine.
see it.
It's fine.
Okay. CK, you have to remind me if I'm, I might go over the time. So you have to
Oh,
remind
okay.
me so I can
We're
speed
starting at
it up.
6:54.
Okay.
Noted.
Thank you.
Okay.
Okay. So I cannot okay. Doesn't wait. So I cannot move my slides. I wonder why. Okay. This is the flow of my presentation, my introduction, the cause of war, why is war happening, what war games of the United States allies conducted or conducting in our region, why is it launching this provocative expensive and destructive military exercises in Asia and the Pacific, and what are the people's responses? So, okay, I became a student activist when I was 18 years old at the University of the Philippines around 1968. The U.S. war of aggression against Vietnam was one of the global events that awakened my activism as it brought to mind the horror that the United States inflicted on our country during the Philippine-American War in 1898 to 1913, where around 1 million Filipinos died. Now, a new generation of young people all over the world are being conscientized by the U.S. and Israel genocidal war against Palestine, the U.S. attack on Venezuela, and now the U.S.-Israel attack on Iran. Though separated by over a century, in the case of our Philippine-American War, and almost 6 decades from the Vietnam War, the United States have always have justified such war to make it appear that it was our savior rather than its aggressor. But this justification masks the reality that the United States is an imperialist power and uses war and conquest to expand its geographic reach, its sources of raw materials and cheap labor, and its sites for profitable investment to ensure its economic, political, and military dominance, which is now being threatened. The cost of war. Imperialist wars are fundamentally driven by geopolitical and economic competition over resources, markets, and strategic influence. The impact of the world's peoples include mass casualties, widespread displacement, economic devastation, and long-lasting political instability, with ordinary civilians disproportionately bearing the brunt of the suffering, as we can see it in Iran, in Palestine, and before that in Iraq and other countries. So there is a comparison of how much the U.S. military budget cost, and it's equivalent in terms of human suffering, and it's equivalent in terms of human development. So the combined U.S. military budget for 2025 to 2026 totaling 1.85 trillion, and it's going to increase, to 2.5 trillion if you include 2027 and 2026. These are some of the equivalents. According to the UN World Food Program, it costs roughly 93 billion per year to fully eliminate acute starvation and global hunger. The equivalence, the US military budget could fund the entire global initiative to end starvation for the next 20 consecutive years, and that's only 5% of the total budget. Ending illiteracy, meaning universal education, UNESCO data indicates that a total $190 billion is needed to completely fulfill the Sustainable Development Goal for global literacy, which involves training hundreds of millions of youth and adults worldwide. The equivalence is only 10.2% of the 2-year U.S. Defense Fund. Accessible health care for the global poor. The World Health Organization, the World Bank estimate the financing gap to achieve universal health coverage across the 54 poorest developing countries at roughly $174 billion per year. This would stop the cycle of hundreds of millions being driven into extreme poverty by out-of-pocket medical bills. The equivalence, reverting just 9.4% of the military money, could fully fund an operational health safety net for the world's most vulnerable populations for a year. The data directly supports the point that global scarcity is a matter of political priorities rather than a true lack of resources. So we say, and I will going to say it again, the money being used for war should go to food, not bombs, books, not bullets, healthcare, not warfare. Why war happens, I would just like to, I know all of you know this already, but always there are economic objectives and geopolitical objectives. Right now, the war of Iran has the following objectives for the United States: petrodollar hegemony. It's very scared that the yuan is going to be used for oil trade, resource control. Iran is the only, outside Venezuela, Iran is the only country in the Middle East that is still not controlled by the United States. And then the military-industrial complex justification for its profits. The geopolitical objectives remains within the purview of maintaining hegemony under the current intensification of inter-imperialist rivalries, especially between the United States and China on the one hand, and the United States and Russia on the other. So there we have the rhetoric versus reality. We have seen that in the Philippines when they invaded the Philippines, Vietnam. Now it's defending democracy and freedom, halting weapons of mass destruction, protecting human rights, ensuring free trade. When we know that there are underlying geopolitical economic reality that serves their economic and geopolitical interests. Okay, now this is the part that's happening right now in many of our countries. The United States war games in Asia and the Pacific. And this is quite important for us because the danger of war in our region, I think, is a reality. Excuse me. Just a moment. The United States and its allies have established an extensive web of interconnected large-scale war games across the Indo-Pacific region. These exercises have expanded aggressively in scope, complexity, and multinational integration to project collective power, counter regional competitors, and prepare for multi-domain warfare. So the Philippines, which occupies a very strategic location in Asia Pacific and in relation to Taiwan and China, we have the Balikatan exercises. This is the premier. Balikatan is shoulder. So the uses it is the shoulder-to-shoulder bilateral flagship exercise between the armed forces of the Philippines and the United States military. The massive 41st exercise from April 20 to May 8, 2026, brought together an unprecedented 17,000 troops. For the first time, it expanded into a robust multinational front featuring active combat forces from Japan, Australia, France, Canada, and New Zealand. It featured high-intensity counter-landing live-fire maneuvers in northern Luzon facing Taiwan and maritime strike operations of Palawan facing the contested West Philippine Sea. And that is where also last May 4, they fired the Tomahawk missile from central Visayas here to Laor Nueva Ecija up here using the Typhoon missile system, which the Philippines has, the first country outside of America which has that missile system. The Typhoon reach makes it possible for the United States to attack the outer rims of China. Another Typhoon missile system is supposed to be in Japan now. Its reach can attack mainland China, including Beijing already. Aside from Balikatan, you have the Cope Thunder, Exercise Kasanga. In Thailand, you have the Cobra Gold, hosted jointly by the US and Thailand. And then in Indonesia, you have the Super Garuda Shield, which used to be a modest bilateral drill. It has morphed into a massive multinational exercise involving forces from Australia, Japan, Singapore, France, and the UK, focusing on combined armed maneuvers and island defense drills. And then you have a regional cooperation afloat readiness and training called CARAT, involving Brunei, Malaysia, and Singapore to boost coastal defense and naval coordination. In East Asia, you have exercises in South Korea, the Freedom Shield. They utilize live field drills and computer simulations. And then you have Japan, the Kin Sword, massive high-stakes biennial field training between the U.S. military and the Japan Self-Defense Forces. Okay.
Hello, Ma'am Judy. You have 3 minutes left, I think.
Okay, so I think I would like to go to I would like to end by the people's responses to these provocative and destructive military exercises. I won't discuss that anymore. Popular responses to exercises launched by the United States have been characterized by strong grassroots civil resistance. So we have direct actions at military bases following the launch. We had protest actions. So regional alliances, we have movements such as the Resist US-led war in Asia and the Pacific. The fisherfolk organizations have launched resistance over livelihood disruption and economic survival. There has been legal challenges also to the use of the missile system within the territory of the Philippines. And then the health sector has called out their concerns over medical humanitarianism, which is under the so-called community health engagements of the exercises, such as dental missions, are actually soft power tools aimed at masking the impacts of military activity. So the resistance and the protest action against U.S. war of aggression in a similar manner, which appeared during the Vietnam War, continues. We need to make it grow. We need to strengthen our alliances domestically and regionally. And to echo our call, food, not bombs, books, not bullets, health, not warfare. Thank you very
Thank you.
much.
Thank you, ma'am. I think you can extend, maybe come back to the presentation you did not talk about, because I think Mr. Powell, the next speaker, is still on his way home. So maybe you can expound. Yes. He
Okay,
said you can
because
take
I
your time.
jumped already. The
Yes.
impact, the social political implications. Okay, so this is like I think it's clear to us that the social political implications, the health implications shared by the previous speakers, especially the speaker from Australia, I think are also true in the Philippines. The trauma, you know, uh, the the physiological impact because of loss of livelihood, the issue of malnutrition. We need to do research also about the expansion of prostitution where there are US troops. We have seen that, the increase in STD related sexual transmitted diseases during the Vietnam War. So I think the most important impact would be in terms of our sovereign foreign policy. Why is that important? It eliminates our capacity to address conflicts via diplomatic means because we are already associated with a foreign power intent in launching wars. We also become the forward-based reality. In the Philippines, the Philippine archipelago into over 500 annual joint military activities effectively converts domestic soil into a logistical launching pad. 500 military exercises. So more than once there are only 365 days. So we're talking every day. There is at least one military exercise going on in the Philippines. You have heightened regional instability and arms racing, while the US frames these war games as critical deterrents against unilateral changes. Regional adversaries view them as aggressive encirclement. China has been very vocal about its protest on the ongoing military exercises and the stationing of military troops in the Philippines. Displacement, economic disruption, live fire zones, and sudden maritime restrictions frequently disrupt local fishing grounds and agricultural areas, cutting off livelihoods for coastal provincial communities to accommodate foreign military timelines. There are no fishing zones declared during military exercises, and it could last for 2 to 3 months. And aid is given, but it's not enough and it's not given to everyone. Fourth, the weaponization of humanitarian aid. Western militaries increasingly embed civil military operations, medical missions, dental missions, and school construction projects under umbrellas like the Pacific Partnership. These projects serve as soft power public relations campaign explicitly designed to manufacture local consent, obscure the destructive intent of combat systems, and normalize a permanent foreign troop presence in civilian spaces. So the danger is there. The provocation is there. We have to strengthen and expand our consciousness raising, especially because mainstream media in the Philippines are very much pro-United States. There are no discussions or very little discussions on American presence in the Philippines, while every night any Chinese provocation is mainstream news. So I think this effort of the Health for the People movement is very much a welcome effort for us to generate concern about what's happening and to develop and strengthen our solidarity against war, against US imperialism, and for people's health. Thank you.
Marika, you're
Okay.
muted.
I'm
Thank
here
you.
now.
I think Marika might be frozen. She warned me that it might happen. So we had a mutual agreement to step in for each other. So take it away, Warwick. Yeah.
All right. Look, thank you very much for the invitation to join you all tonight. And it's been wonderful to hear such considered reflections on some of the local dimensions that are threatening peace in our region and, of course, contributing to warfare in other parts of the world. What I thought I'd do tonight is, having listened to all the speakers, some of which was from my car and some of which was from my office here at home, draw some threads together and perhaps contextualize it with some reflections on the implications of the recent war against Iran and what that might mean for the region here in North Asia and Southeast Asia. Firstly, what I won't do is go into any of the broader geopolitical or strategic questions around global hegemony, the pursuit of American dominance and those sorts of things. Previous speakers, I think, have touched on those matters, and from my perspective, my principal focus is going to be on some more nitty-gritty questions to start with. So my reflections tonight really break into four main parts. The first part will be some comments concerning the state of the war against Iran, particularly the military dimensions and where we're at. Secondly, I'll then extend from that to touch on what I think some of the implications are for the Asian region. Thirdly, extending again further from that, I'll explore in a little bit more detail some of the permutations, if you will, or the potential scenarios that open out within Asia. And then lastly, I'd like to draw some concluding thoughts around the challenges that regional peace face and the challenges that regional peace activists face and need to be mindful of as they campaign for new ways of doing things to avoid war, but more importantly, to build peace. So firstly, in terms of the state of play in the war against Iran, the first comment that I would make is that the United States, which initiated this war, has experienced or has suffered a strategic defeat. And I say that because the United States has failed in all of its key objectives. Its principal objective was regime change, what they call regime change, a change of the government of the Islamic Republic of Iran, and it sought to do that firstly through an aerial bombardment and an execution of that nation's leadership. The decapitation strategy did not work. It certainly did succeed in assassinating the Ayatollah and a number of leaders of the country's leadership, but it did not lead to a collapse of the government or the institutions of government. Quite the reverse, in fact. I think what we have seen is a consolidation of the institutions of state. Secondly, the aim was, should that decapitation strategy fail, the aim was then to instigate a popular revolt against the government. So that was plan B. The popular revolt would be prosecuted again through significant aerial bombardment. The theory behind that is that if you can bomb a population and cause significant suffering, the population would then blame their government and overthrow the government. We know that this was the theory at work because during the course of the first couple of days of the campaign, President Trump of the United States made it clear to the people of Iran that the Americans had done their job and was calling on the people of Iran to rise up and take back their country, I think was the rhetoric. That theory also founded on the shoals of reality. It is quite clear now that the population rallied around the flag, as they say. Even critics of the government turned back towards the government and the country itself. We then saw an attempt by the United States to destroy the Iranian military capability. And you will no doubt have heard much talk about the destruction of the Iranian Navy. You know, so many boats are at the bottom of the ocean, etc., etc. And the various moments of braggadocio from President Trump about the decimation of the Iranian military. I think it's fair to say that whilst the United States aerial campaign has delivered significant damage both to military, some military infrastructure and of course significant civilian infrastructure and causing significant civilian deaths and casualties, that the military campaign has also failed. We can say that with a certain amount of confidence because if the military campaign had been successful, then the United States' principal infrastructure within the region would still be standing, and the United States would be able to operate from that infrastructure. The reality is that the Iranians have successfully destroyed or sufficiently damaged all of America's bases within the Middle East, to a point where the Americans have been forced to retreat from those bases and not operate their campaign from those bases. That has significant implications for how the United States could subsequently prosecute its aerial campaign. In plain nuts and bolts terms, it meant that the United States had to fly aeroplanes in from further away, which reduced the number of sorties that could be flown, and therefore reduced the amount of missiles and bombs that it could launch on a daily basis. That by depleting the American bases within the region, the Iranians successfully dented the velocity and the frequency and the intensity of attacks from the Americans. So the end outcome of all of this is that the Iranians also successfully exercise what we now call the Hormuz weapon. They have been able to secure control over the Strait of Hormuz to a point where the Americans actually don't have a conventional military solution to this problem. We know that there's no conventional military solution to this problem because had there been one, it would have been exercised. It hasn't been exercised because the American military planners understand that, in fact, they don't have the means by which they can dislodge the Iranians and disarm them successfully so as to wrestle control of the straits back. To successfully wrestle control of the straits is likely to require the complete disarmament of Iran. And for that to take place, if you look at the experiences of the Iraqi war, for example, given population size, military size, and landmass size, the Americans would need to land troops in the order of 1 million plus to seek to occupy the country of Iran itself, so as to disarm Iran and take control of the Strait of Hormuz. The Americans are not in a position to do that, and even if they implemented a large-scale draft, it would take a long time to pull that together. The upshot of all of this is that the entire architecture of security in the region, premised entirely on American bases, has been undermined. The future of the region is likely to be one in which the American forward base presence will be substantially diminished or possibly not even there at all. Time will tell on that front. Moving on then from that very quick assessment of the lay of the land to implications for Asia, what we can now say with a certain amount of certainty, together with some mathematical analytics around the dynamics of any future war, is that the American forward base's presence in Asia as part of its security architecture is just as vulnerable as the bases were in the Middle East. And what that ultimately means is that we are now witnessing the end of America's Asia deterrence based on that architecture. Modelling undertaken by a colleague of mine estimates that on very conservative assumptions favourable to the Americans, that the Americans would lose anywhere from about 80 airframes to 320 or so airframes out of 400 or so airframes stationed at bases in the region within the first week of an intense peer-to-peer conflict with China. And that's based on assumptions such as American electronic warfare being able to effectively undermine the targeting success of Chinese missiles, and that a substantial amount of American planes would be protected by hard covering. Now, that hard covering doesn't exist in many places, but it is no doubt likely to be built. It also assumes a certain velocity and intensity of attack from China based on publicly known information about the Chinese arsenal. We suspect that the estimates of the Chinese arsenal that the Americans report substantially underestimate the size of the arsenal, because the arsenal that the Americans report would suggest that China's entire arsenal is no greater than that of Iran's. And that seems to be a highly implausible proposition. So we are now looking at a security environment in the region where the principal foundations are actually no longer viable. American forward-based Asia deterrence is no longer a viable proposition. The other thing about what's happened over the course of not only the war in Ukraine, but also in the Middle East, is that the American supply chains and production capacity has been exposed for their limitations. The rate of depletion of American munitions is such that it will now take between 4 and 5 years to replace what the Americans expended in 4 weeks in their attacks on Iran. The air defense capabilities as well as the offensive capabilities have therefore been severely depleted, and should the Americans re-engage with Iran, and there is of course every possibility that that will happen, the American arsenal will continue to be depleted. That is going to change the nature of American calculus within the region, and I think we are already seeing that. Now, what do I mean by all of this? And this, I guess, is the third part of my quick presentation tonight. The third part is that the Americans are readjusting their posture in the face of these new material realities, not only their own limitations, but also actually a recognition of China's expansive modernization and scale. And it is doing this in two main ways. The first way is that, as previous speakers have intimated, the Americans are actually actively and intensely mobilizing their so-called allies in the region to take on greater financial responsibility and frontline risk. This is what I would call the proxyification of the allies. The Americans have, of course, been pursuing this as a broad strategy now in other parts of the world, the most obvious one being in Ukraine, but also in the Middle East, where it banked on its allies in terms of the Gulf monarchies doing some of the heavy lifting. So what we're likely to see in the first instance is an intensification of American pressure on allied countries to increase spending, which is of course what we're seeing, and for allied countries to enable greater interoperability with American systems so that allied resources and allied personnel are ultimately put to use first. The other thing that we're seeing in the region is that some countries, of course, are responding to what is an emerging structural vacuum by trying to fill it themselves, either through fear or through opportunity or a combination of both. Japanese remilitarization is a combination of both. It wants to be both a good, loyal American client state, as well as satisfy the militarization aspirations of certain sections of the Japanese body politic. It sees the emerging vacuum of American stepping back, so to speak, within the region as an opportunity for Japan to step forward. That, of course, raises a range of concerns across the region, leading to greater regional instability. The Republic of Korea similarly has great doubts about the security offered by the American nuclear umbrella, so much so that for a number of years now, public opinion surveys have consistently shown that the citizens of the Republic of Korea no longer supporting the idea of reliance on the American nuclear umbrella, but are now pushing for the Republic of Korea to also develop its own nuclear capabilities. Unfortunately, I think that this is these dynamics in terms of demands from populations and ultimately governments in the region to nuclearize will intensify rather than diminish. We also have other dynamics which I think often people don't remark upon, but I think it's worth quickly touching on. So these are the sort of hard power elements, is of course the DPRK to the north, which has a strategic alliance arrangement or a treaty arrangement with Russia. And we also have Vietnam, which also has a deep strategic relationship with Russia as well. The reason why I mention this is because the DPRK is a nuclear power in its own right, of course, but also because what we're seeing is Russia re-emerging as a Pacific power as well. So the dynamics within the Asia Pacific is not purely contained to ostensibly the tensions between the United States and China, but it also now includes Russia as a significant player with growing interests in the region, whether it's economic interests and, of course, security interests that are being consolidated as we speak tonight with the visit of President Putin to Beijing. So these are the kind of dynamics that I think are at play, which of course is creating more fluidity within the region, which brings significantly more risks and greater challenges if we are to keep the region free of war and conflict. So the last part of my presentation really tries to, I guess, quickly address, if you don't mind, some thoughts that I've got on things that we need to be trying to do in the context that I've painted. The first one is that in this environment of fluidity, whilst it does invite some remilitarization, it also opens up a space for a different set of dialogues that can be advanced. And these are dialogues that could be advanced around ideas of essentially a new regional security architecture. We can't leave the idea of a security architecture to just a small number of nations, namely Japan, for example. And what we need to be thinking about is how countries and forces within countries that are committed to regional peace can mobilize around ideas of regional neutrality, the ideas of indivisible security as a foundational principle of regional peace and security, and that the security arrangements that are arrived at for the region are created and framed by the nations of the region for the region itself. We need to be thinking along the lines of broadening the question of security from a narrow one based on ideas of negative peace and deterrence to a positive one based on the indivisibility of security and the indivisibility of security and prosperity. So these are some of the broad parameters that I think we need to be advocating to policymakers and to others within the region at large. Anchored, I believe, in, well, the opportunity here is actually for ASEAN to take the next step in its own evolution and play a far greater role. And the reason I say that is because it is inconceivable that the region as a whole would be comfortable with either China or Japan or Australia as some of the major economies of the region and military forces becoming the dominant military actor without a countervailing presence. And that countervailing presence really, I think, can be anchored by a continuation and a consolidation of ASEAN centrality and ASEAN neutrality. These are, however, challenging times, and they're challenging times because what we have is not just a military environment, but an interweaving of American presence into every corner of social, economic, and political life and cultural life across the region, to a point where we have networks of think tanks, funded think tanks, networks of individuals and organizations whose principal job it is to advocate for, for greater military expenditure, advocate for greater concerns around regional fear and paranoia, etc., etc. We also have an environment where, of course, the Americans historically have been a very significant economic presence, and it is important to recognize that. So how do we go forward from here? I think we need to be able to do a number of things. We need to be able to progressively disentangle our national economies from exposure to American economic coercion, and we can do that by reducing our exposure to fossil fuels and to enabling our national economies to be more sovereign in terms of their critical inputs, namely in energy and in food. We need to have a regional architecture that integrates regional economies in ways that buttress common and shared commitments to peace and prosperity rather than ones that create divisions. We need to ultimately increase the material costs of Americans and their allies to maintaining their military presences across the region. Now, that has to be done through political campaigning as well as through intensified pressure on critical supply chains that make it more difficult for these kinds of military operations to be sustained into the future. So the environment is one which is very tough. It's one that is in a great degree of flux. There are risks, challenges, but also opportunities to forge a future in which peace and prosperity and it play a more central organizational role in the way that we arrange our collective lives, as opposed to what is currently the case, which is a great deal of talk about war and destruction. So, look, that's where I wanted to leave it. Happy to take some questions. Thank you once again. I hope I've stuck to time. I can't really tell.
That's okay. Okay, thank you, Dr. Warwick Powell. He is an adjunct professor at Queensland University of Technology. His research focuses on the intersection of international geopolitical economy, supply chains, digitalization, and payment systems. So he's an acclaimed author of several reviewed peered articles and 3 books. So thank you again, Dr. Warwick Powell, for your valuable insights, and also to our to Ma'am Judy Tagiwalo for sharing her input. So I think there's no questions yet in our Zoom chat. So I think I will just pose a question to both our speakers. So I think in the mainstream discussion of public health, militarism, and the control of imperialist U.S. and how it directly affects the health of the people is not really put forward. In fact, in the Philippines, the U.S. Pours in a huge amount of money for health aids just to to manifest their stay here in the Philippines. So actually, in the Philippines, the people have a huge trust to the US government rather than China. So it's like a competition here. So I think it is a challenge not only in the Philippines but also in the region on how we can, change that and put forward the inputs that were discussed here. So for my question, I think this is very relevant. So there is a Pax Silica formation. So in the Philippines recently announced that they joined the Pax Silica. So the U.S. Undersecretary for Business Affairs was here in the Philippines to visit a site wherein they will put in the economic security zone here in the Philippines. So it is in a former military base, and it is also a home to indigenous peoples community. So to our speakers, would you like to discuss or share your insights on the Pax Silica initiative?
Judy first.
Okay. Would you like to start first, Warwick?
I'm happy to. Look, I don't mind either way. Look, I think that there's a few issues to unpack here. In terms of the Philippines specifically, I think one of the challenges, of course, with being existing in a post or a quasi post-colonial environment is that colonialism always casts a very long shadow. And one of the shadows that colonialism casts is the deep embedding within political institutions and cultural institutions of a whole range of influential forces and personnel. So it embeds vested interests within certain status quo arrangements. And that tends to be the case and has tended to be the case actually across most post-colonial environments. They're hardly post-colonial. The post-colonial piece really was a formalization of national sovereignty without actually enabling genuine sovereignty through economic and institutional power. So that's my sort of long distance take from in terms of the challenges that a place like the Philippines confronts. The upside, though, is that again, from the perspective of countries like the Philippines, but not only countries like the Philippines, is that it's always worth remembering that there was an Asia before the Europeans and the Americans. And that Asia, which was 400 to 500 years ago, existed in a very different set of configurations, operating to a very different set of logics. And there is a rich tradition in those regional pre-European logics that have actually enabled peoples from across the region to interact with each other in a consistent way in an environment of relative peace. So I would suggest that there's things that we can draw from a pre-European historical point of view. In terms of Pax Silica per se, clearly it's a response to the pressure that was applied last year after the tariff war, when China ultimately responded with restrictions on the export of a range of rare earth elements and critical minerals. And
Yeah.
we know from a range of reports including reports by a company called Gavini that has been commissioned by the Pentagon to evaluate its supply chain risks, that a large proportion of the American military industrial complex, from munitions through to aircraft carriers through to fighter jets, are actually dependent on over 10,000 Chinese supplier companies for different inputs. And untangling that is actually a significant challenge for the Americans themselves. From an American perspective, I can see why this would be seen as a very significant risk. It's not much fun when you're trying to build up armaments to attack somebody when the person you want to attack controls the things that you need to build the bombs to attack them with. Not surprisingly, they're trying to reduce their risk from Chinese control of upstream components. Easier said than done. It's one thing to sign all these agreements, and we have seen over the course of the past 10 to 15 years the Americans and Europeans signing a bunch of agreements and making lots of announcements about what they're going to do to counter China's Belt and Road Initiative, etc., etc. And by and large, in practical terms, all of these initiatives come to nothing. I'm not saying that this initiative will come to nothing, but I think that there are some very significant practical hurdles. It certainly isn't something that will happen in 12 months or 18 months, regardless of what President Trump says. Building a rare earth elements and critical mineral supply chain to a point where there is refining capacity at scale and at cost in ways that can match what is currently available is a 10+ year activity regardless. And not to mention the fact that we are dealing with a moving target. That's the first thing. The second thing I will say is that often what we find with the Americans on these sorts of things is that they're fighting yesterday's battles. And one of the things that has happened in warfare is the emergence of low-cost drones. And low-cost drones in many respects are nowhere near as dependent upon this complex supply chain that the Americans are going to commit a lot of effort into building. I'm not here to help the Americans figure out, of course, how they can better prepare for a future war, but my point simply is that the initiatives like Pax Silica, whatever their strategic intentions or origins were, are incredibly difficult things to pull off, in part because what they're trying to replace is a set of physical and commercial arrangements that took 20, 30 to 40 years to evolve, right? And to a point where, China obviously dominates mining and processing, but it's not just the fact that they dominate it in volume terms, it's the fact that China has the technical capabilities to refine at high volume to levels that are necessary for much of what we're talking about, military grade applications, and to achieve those sorts of levels will actually be incredibly difficult to do. So that's my sort of general reactions to the Pax Silica stuff. In some ways, it's a little bit Pax silly.
Yeah,
Right.
they call it Pax Silica, but it's a misnomer because we think it's a war silica. They're going to have access to over 4,000 acres of land, or that's 1,620 hectares. And there are people and communities there who are going to be displaced. The setting up of new factories would have impact on the water sources of the communities, and they're going to produce supposedly, artificial intelligence, semiconductors, electronics, and critical mineral processing, which I think you have said are now being produced. China has the monopoly in this, has dominance on this. So I think it's part of the preparation for war. Its location is beside the former U.S. military base, Clark Air Base, and there's also setting up an ammunition factory depot there. Aside from an oil refueling station, south of Manila in Mindanao. There has been issues about sovereignty. The United States want their laws to be operative in the 4,000 acre of the economic hub. But as of yesterday, the Philippines is saying no way. Our laws will be the one to be followed there. But I think what our friend from Okinawa has just shared with us, where Japanese government, the Philippine government, like the Japanese government, eventually will have no say on what's going to happen in the uh, war silica project. And it's not only the Philippines, other countries have been invited. I think most of our country governments will be invited to join the United States in the same manner that they have joined the war exercises. So yes, no to Pax Silica, no to war silica.
If I could just
Thank
add
you.
one
Thank
more thing, if I could just add one
Yeah,
more
sure.
thing on all of this, not only does creating this new production thing displace people, destroy ecologies, undermine life and healthy, the opportunities to have a healthy and meaningful life today, um, these facilities become targets in and of themselves. And I'll just give you a sense of distances traveled. The Philippines and Okinawa are within range of any short and medium range ballistic missile that emanates from a Chinese silo. That's the first thing I'll say, right? I'm not advocating it, I'm just pointing it out. And here's the scary bit. At Mach 10, okay, which is a hypersonic speed that Chinese missile capabilities have, Palawan is within 7 minutes, and Okinawa is less than 6 minutes. There is no time for reaction. The destruction will be horrendous, and but this is precisely what we talked about in my colleague's own modelling. Actually, points to is the intensity and at high volume. This is not defendable. And that's why I talked about the fact that the American defense architecture is no longer viable. Right? This is an opportunity for for sustained campaigning for a renewed regional peace architecture because there is so much uncertainty now. Needless to say, the other side of the equation will be rapidly trying to fill this void, saying we need to amp up. We need to have more bases. We need to have more this, more that, more military expenditure, etc., etc. But my point is that given the state of the American arsenal, given the developments in missile technologies and drone technologies, given the sheer volumes of drones that we're talking about, there is no way that the air defense capabilities that are deployed across American allied territories, including Australia, have the ability to intercept sufficiently any incoming missiles. They will knock some out, no doubt, but they simply will be overwhelmed in both qualitative terms. The missiles are too fast, and in quantitative terms, there are too many drones sapping up air defense, followed up by missiles coming in behind. Right? The current architecture is not defendable, which means that all these things that are being built in the name of deterrence, security, etc., are nothing more than targets, right? And focal points of danger for ordinary people in these countries in the name of American objectives.
True.
You, Chico, you're raising
Yeah,
your hand.
yes. Pursue the point a bit further and make him even more, a bit more graphic. Okay, Masaki and Abi and I a while back, okay, had a brief exchange, okay, in our chat group, okay, and it was pointed out that that the Tokyo Bay conurbation, okay, which includes again Yokosuka, okay, Yokosuka, of course, is the home base, okay? Home port of the US 7th Fleet, okay? Which is about 18 kilometers from Yokohama, okay? And 44 kilometers from Tokyo Central, okay? So if you count the entire Tokyo Bay conurbation, okay, including Tokyo, Yokohama, and Yokosuka, okay, within roughly about 50-kilometer radius, okay, and depending on the spectrum of attacks, okay, that is conceivable, okay, on that conurbation, okay, we're talking about an area which has about 40 million people, okay, in the Tokyo Bay conurbation, okay, and accounts for about 40% of Japan's GDP, okay, right? Yeah. Now, we're leaving aside Okinawa, Sasebo, okay, on Kyushu, okay, where there's another sizable US naval base. As a Malaysian, okay, I'm I'm a bit attentive, okay, to the fact that in Singapore, okay, um, there's a de facto US naval base, okay, at Changi. Now, of course, Changi Naval Base, okay, doesn't have as huge a bullseye, okay, painted on its back, okay, as Yokosuka, okay, and by extension Tokyo, okay. But Singapore, okay, is right at the entrance, southern entrance to the Malacca Strait, okay. Yeah. Aside from the U.S. naval base there, U.S. Naval aircraft, okay, P-8A Poseidons, okay, operate out of Singapore air bases, and they carry out maritime surveillance and anti-submarine warfare, yeah, duties, okay. So, Warwick, I know that you sounded a little bit contrarian, okay, about the strategic importance of the Malacca Strait now, okay. Could you share your thoughts, okay, on that issue, okay, maritime
Sure.
choke points, interdiction, etc. Yeah.
Sure. I just thought I'd share this screen just to give you a sense of geography. Needless to say, I know I don't need to remind everybody, but this is where the majority of American bases are, the green dots, and the red dots is where the People's Liberation Army brigades are located. Everything is within range. And of course, the counter argument is to say that everything in China is within range too, which is true. But when you're fighting on someone else's front doorstep, Chinese capabilities, their supply chains, their industrial base ultimately will overwhelm anything that is thrown at them. If the Americans can't defend their infrastructure in the Middle East, how do you think they're going to be able to defend this chain of infrastructure, which is thousands and miles away from critical supply chains? They won't be able to. Okay, so it's just worth people getting their head in the right space. It's a horrible space to be in, right? But we see all of these military displays of strength and all the joint maneuvers and exercises and things. I mean, the Typhon weapon is a formidable weapon, except there's not a lot of them. The THAAD air defense capability, that was one of the principal air defense capabilities deployed in Israel and the Middle East. And there's not enough of them. There's, from memory, 10 or so in the world, maybe 15 or 16, I can't remember offhand. Half of them are, I think, are gone now. I mean, these are just realities. So you've got to remember that this infrastructure is set up to maybe fire 8 interceptors. So depending on the setup, they'll fire 8 interceptors at a time. And the maths is that you need to fire at least 2 interceptors for every 1 incoming. Okay, so 8 interceptors will be fired to deal with 4 incoming. The fact is that there'll be a lot more incoming than interceptors are capable of dealing with, right? The nature of air warfare and countervailing defense has changed. The Strait of Malacca, yeah, look, 30 years ago, the Strait of Malacca was an obvious choke point. And we've seen how states can interpose on those choke points because we've just been watching it happen in real time in terms of the Strait of Hormuz, right? But we've got to understand the conditions that actually make that viable and possible. The Strait of Hormuz is 23 kilometers wide from memory, 21 maybe. And Iran obviously controls one entire coastline and has had 40 years to embed a bunch of infrastructure into the coastline to support its defense of a closure of the Strait of Hormuz. That environment is very particular. Of course, we then, and as I discussed earlier, the Americans actually don't have a conventional military means of unlocking that. We come to Malacca Straits, right? Well, it's a much narrower body of water, right? Less than 3 kilometers at the narrowest point from memory. And if it was to be blockaded, the question is what happens? Because let's not forget that a blockade is an act of war, right? So if an impacted country then decided that it wanted to do something about this blockade, then under international law, it has every right to do something about it, right? And in the name of self-defense, right? So the question is how is this particular blockade sustained? And to be able to sustain a blockade in an environment of war will mean that the actor undertaking the blockading will either want to call the bluff of the person, the other side, who is saying, look, leave our ships alone, otherwise we're going to launch missiles at yours, or they will actually, end up getting attacked. This is why it's very dangerous. Now, is America going to blockade the Strait of Malacca in the name of blockading China when this is a direct engagement with another nuclear power? Well, I would suggest they won't. I know that there's an argument, and there's some reason to the argument that the political culture in Washington does have elements that are pretty crazy, that are driven by eschatological obsessions, who would go down this particular path. I'm not convinced that the Pentagon and those who ultimately are in charge of many of these final decisions will necessarily do that. We've already seen the reluctance of the Pentagon to pursue some of Donald Trump's own ambitious maneuvers, and that's been causing some problems for the Americans already. So I doubt that the Americans today would consider a blockade. It's an extremely provocative move. Now, should they ultimately do proceed with the blockade, it's because we've entered into a period of war. Okay, and if that is the case, I've done the calculations, and the blockading vessels are within about 9 minutes of launch facilities of hypersonic missiles, and of course, there's an argument about submarines. Yep, well, who knows where China's capabilities are now in terms of detecting submarines all through there. But if we've reached a point where we're talking about an American blockade of the Strait of Malacca, we are in war. That's basically it. So, and there is only one war that we will be in, and that is a war between two nuclear powers. Now, that leads me to my last point in terms of the Strait of Malacca. This is why ASEAN in particular, and the big states in ASEAN, and I mean by them Indonesia, Malaysia, and Singapore, all of whom have a direct stake in the Strait of Malacca not becoming part of a blockade. They need to think very hard now about the regional architecture and how they need to fashion a regional architecture that minimizes the likelihood and the risk that the Americans would even contemplate this going forward. And that's the challenge for ASEAN in today's environment.
Thank you, Dr. Warwick Powell and Ma'am Judy Tagiwalo. So I think we took a lot of time because the discussion is very rich, and there are still actually some questions coming in the group chat. But I think for the interest of time of our discussion, and some of the questions posted in the chat box was already answered during the input and the Q&A discussion. So I think for our part, we will take note of some of the questions that were not yet answered, or we will try to reach out to those who ask questions and send them references. Sorry, we are running out of time and it's already quite late. So thank you again to everyone for participating for our in our discussion. And for reference, we will release this video, and I hope we can send it to a lot of our networks, and also the presentations of our speakers. They are very rich, and a lot of resources will be uh, we can get from that, and we can use in our campaigns. So to close our discussion, our forum, may I call on the coordinator of PHM War, Conflict, Occupation, and Migration Thematic Circle, Miss Maria Hamlin Zuniga.
Hello, everybody. There's not much time left, and I think that this has been an absolutely brilliant webinar, and I'm asking that it be distributed widely all over the world, because so many things that have been discussed about your region, about CEOP, is also relevant in other parts of the world. I just wanted to say that I think that as an organization that is anti-imperialist, like the People's Health Movement, what we have to do is, like some of you have said, we have to resist, we have to organize, we have to build alliances around the world. And this has just been a brilliant moment this morning. And I hope that the People's Health Movement can make a real effort to share this with our membership all around the world. I want to thank each of the people who has presented. It has just been an inspiration to hear your commitment to your particular region of the world. I think we have to recognize the decline of the empire, the decline of the President of the United States, who is in dementia, and the fact that the Minister of Defense, who calls himself the Minister of War, is also a person who is dedicated to white Christian nationalism and doesn't recognize the importance of the diversity and the beauty of our world and want to preserve it. And one thing that is important, I think, is to see that about 79% of the people of the United States are not in favor of the war. They're not in favor of what is happening in Iran. Most of them don't know what is happening in Gaza because of the mass media and how it does not tell the truth about what's happening in the world. So the People's Health Movement has a commitment since our founding to work against wars, against occupation, and against all of this militarization that's taking place. So let us really, really organize locally and organize internationally and build these alliances that are so important. Thank all of you for your wonderful presentations.
So I think this is where our program ends. Thank you again, everyone, to all our speakers, to PHM SAYAP and the PHM War, Conflict, and Occupation and Migration Thematic Circle for organizing this webinar. So for everyone in our Zoom, you can leave your emails in our chat box so we can send you the references, or you can subscribe in the social media sites and pages of PHM, so we can. I hope this is not our first discussion. We will for sure organize more and more and more.